So my name is Matt Aimonetti, and I'm a Rails Ruby consultant here in San Diego. And today we're going to talk about something I hate. It's JavaScript. Or at least I used to hate JavaScript. I'm one of these developers that, if it's not Ruby, I don't like it. Not really. But anyway, I really didn't like JavaScript for a long time for many, many reasons. And I discovered that I might be able to like JavaScript. So even though I'm not a JavaScript expert, I'll try to show you what I discovered, and maybe we're going to all learn together. So we're going to talk about behavior-oriented JavaScript with progressive enhancement and not graceful degradation. So we'll see the difference, and we'll go through all of that. If you want more information, you can go on my blog, railsontheRun.com. I blogged about that a few times, and you'll find more information there. So let's look at the first example here. 4 different ways of opening a link on a different page. So the first one is what I probably used to do a long time ago. Can anyone tell me why it's really wrong to do the first line? Because what? Right, so href is not a URL, so that's not, why is that a problem? Yeah, if you cannot execute JavaScript, you're in trouble. So basically, it will not do anything here. The second line, it's basically the same thing, but here we have an href, which actually won't do anything if you don't have JavaScript. But at least the JavaScript has been put on an on-click event, so it's going to be a bit better. But still, if you don't have JavaScript, there's nothing happening. And then the third line is what I used to do all the time before, and that's basically I put my href as being the link, so my page.html, and then I put on-click window open this href. And that sounded really good to me, apart that we have some nasty JavaScript in the middle of the HTML. Apart from that, it looked good. But I discovered we could do it even better and cleaner looking at the fourth line, which is just href, and then we have a class. And I can tell you the last line is going to work. It works very well, and we're going to see how that works. So before we do that, let's go back in time and see what happened when people discovered that line 1 and 2 were bad, and they switched back. They went to line 3. So let me just show you. Line 1 and 2, bad. They said, oh, we need a solution for line 3. And they came up with, okay, the remote control doesn't work. Graceful degradation. So what's graceful degradation? Graceful degradation is basically you create a page that works with and without JavaScript. And the way of doing that is that the page will degrade to a less advanced one if JavaScript is not enabled in the browser. So if we go back, line number 3, we have a very good example of graceful degradation, where if we don't have JavaScript, my link will still work, and the page will open. It will not open in a new window, but it will still open properly. So the behavior or what's expected would work. So that was graceful degradation, and that's great, but some people said, well, this is good, but we need to find even better. And they said we need to come up with a new best practice called progressive enhancement. So what that is, it's basically people saying, well, graceful degradation is good, but a lot of people don't do it. But it's not very dry. People repeat themselves all the time. Because if I go back to my example, everywhere I have a link, I need to add this on-click. So now you have this HTML page with a lot of links that open on a new window, and for all of them, I need to put the same behavior, on-click, do this. On top of that, a lot of people would just not do it anymore because budget cut, because your client says you need to release the product right now. We don't care about people not having JavaScript. So a lot of time you would actually not do graceful degradation, or you would do it at the beginning of the project and then you would just forget about it. So they said, well, let's do it in a different way because we're lazy developers and we have people putting pressure on us, so we know that would happen. So let's start by building basic functionality available to all. So the first thing you do when you write a web application is that you make sure there's no JavaScript, basically. You make sure it works with just HTML and all the functions are there for everybody to use. So don't put the Ajax stuff you love and the client love right at the beginning. Just first make it work without anything at all. Then once you have that, you build the advanced features on top of these foundations. So now you're sure that your application will always work even if the client doesn't have JavaScript. A lot of time I hear people telling me, well, but everybody has JavaScript. Well, first, that's not true. And a very good argument I give my clients is that when you have a Google search engine browsing, or Google bot browsing your website, it doesn't have JavaScript. So it's not going to click on the link. It will just see a dash, and it's not going to work. So that's very important to think about that when you think about JavaScript in your application. So now let's see how you can do that. How can you get the, okay, I'll just say it. How can you get this sexy fourth line here? So how do you do that? The first thing we're going to try to do is to register event handlers programmatically. So what does that mean? Is that we're going to register events. When the user does that or when the page does that, we're going to react to it. So this will be our handlers. And to do that, we're going to use the CSS selectors to select the elements to register. So that's very neat because now we can say all the links with this div will react the same way. So I define one behavior, and using the CSS, this behavior will be applied to all the links. And that's really cool. And the last thing, or the last rule, is to keep things separate. And we'll talk about this one because it makes a lot of sense to me now. It did not a long time ago. So let's talk about something we all know, the MVC paradigm. If you use Rails, and I'm sure most of us use Rails or another framework, most of the new web framework and few very old ones use or still have an MVC paradigm. M for model, V for view, and C for controller. And I just want to look at the V from the MVC, so the view. And this is usually how we define the views. We used to have one big file with HTML and the style inside, and I hope that nobody does that anymore. And usually we define and we have two layers. We have one for the structure, an HTML file, and we have one with the CSS. If you don't do that, seriously, you need to do it. So we have this HTML, we have the CSS. The problem is, where do we put the JavaScript? Well, obviously, JavaScript doesn't go in the CSS. It's not going to work. So let's just put it in HTML. And that's what we've been doing. And that works, but it's not best practice. It's a pain to maintain. Usually, you don't even know what's going on. And if you use, one of the JavaScript debugger, like Firebug on one of these, you will see when you browse websites, you get a lot of JavaScript errors and you don't know what's going on. So what we want to do is to keep everything separate, and we're going to add a third layer for the behavior. Because what JavaScript does basically is just handling all the behaviors we have. You know, the user click on a link, the user roll over a link, the user submit a form, the user clicked on the pagination link. All of that are behaviors that we can extract in a third layer. So the structure, the HTML, is very simple. I'm sure everybody can read that and understand that. There is nothing cryptic about it. If you need to have somebody else maintaining your code, that will be really easy. You can reuse the structure all over the place because we just use the class. It's not going to be a problem. The presentation is just CSS, so everybody knows, well, I hope everybody knows CSS. And you know how to do something like that. But let's look at the third layer, the behavior layer, and that's the interesting one. What we do is we will add a behavior being an event, and we say, take a link that has a pop-up div, and when there's a click on it, do something. So behave as expected, and open a window with this href, that is the one from this being the link itself, and open it into a blank window and return false. So people will, if you have JavaScript and you have this behavior, the people will not follow the link. They will stay on the same page and the behavior will be applied. So now that we have this, I can define this behavior once and have it used everywhere on my website. If now I need to change it, there's only one place. And I hate JavaScript, or I used to hate JavaScript, but when I see that, I'm like, wow, this is really beautiful. This is really easy to handle, and I can deal with that. Even though I still don't like the language, I can really deal with that, and I can organize it in a way that makes sense to me, and I keep everything separate, and I'm not lost every time I see a JavaScript line that is, 5 lines, actually, not 1 line. So that's how you would handle the behavior. Now, JavaScript doesn't have these classes built in, so you need to do something to end up with this result. And I chose 2 choices. The first one is jQuery plus LiveQuery. jQuery is a great JavaScript library that is not used by Rails by default, but you have a jQuery plugin. If you don't want to use Prototype and you want to use jQuery, you can just change the library and you have all the helpers that come with it. A lot of people using MERB like using jQuery. Since MERB is not built in on Prototype, you can do whatever you want. It's a bit easier. So if you want to use jQuery, jQuery has a plugin called LiveQuery that would help you doing exactly the same thing as what I just showed you. And looking at the code here, you can see that it's exactly the same thing as what we saw before. I have a link that is a pop-up as a pop-up div, pop-up class, and I do a LiveQuery on it. If you click on it, there's an event that will be passed and we'll just open it. And actually there's a mistake in the JavaScript, but just don't look at it. Or you can use my favorite, Prototype and LowPro. Prototype has been updated recently to version 1.6, and a lot of the LowPro library has been moved into the core of Prototype. So LowPro is really light now, and you can do more or less this thing directly with Prototype, but not in the same sexy way. So that's why I use LowPro. And LowPro has a lot of also behaviors built in for links and forms, so it would automatically do the remote calls to the server. So that's very nice. And this is the example I used before, so you just recognize the example. Few resources I put here. The first one is the Prototype website. Then it's Dan Webb website. Dan Webb is the author of LowPro. LowPro has now its own wiki, and we have a Google group also. You can go and check and ask all your questions there. jQuery, all the information jQuery in my blog. Now I want to show you something. I think I'll show you some live code so you can see how it looks. I posted a blog a few weeks ago about how to do Ajax pagination in less than 5 minutes. And I was really not lying, because with using LowPro, you can just write 4 lines, and your pagination that was working before with simple HTML can be in Ajax. Can be in Ajax. So let me just show you, if I can. Okay. So this is a program. This is just an application of mine I'm working on, and I just want to show you how it looks for a real file. So let me just make it bigger. There we go. So, first line, you don't care. Second line here, it's basically a nice little helper we have in LowPro, which says every time there is an Ajax call, reload all the behaviors, because a behavior can only be applied to something that is already in the DOM. So if it's not in it, the behavior will not work. So after an Ajax call, you just reload everything, and I just put it to true because I make some Ajax calls in this page. And you can see here I have a behavior on this link with a 90 start timer button. When there's a click on it, I will toggle the button, and I will toggle another thingy, and then I will restart my timer, and then I return false because I don't want the button to do anything if you don't have JavaScript. Now, I'm not going to show you the HTML because I really cannot. But if you don't have JavaScript, the button would work. What I did is just added a layer on top of it. So if you do have JavaScript, we have extra features. And this is the whole concept of doing unobtrusive JavaScript. Any questions? What do you mean this one? The first? Oh, in this one? Oh, this toggle? Which? Oh, this one here. I'm not using the jQuery library, so I don't know if that works. So you might have to reload it manually. You have an option, at least in this library in LowPro. You can load it manually. I don't know if I don't think I have it here in this code. I don't have to. I think that in jQuery, live query, you can make a call to just reload all the behaviors at once. So yeah, it's just this one uses a timer if I remember correctly, and based on it checks on the Ajax call, and when there's an Ajax call, it would just reload everything. You can write it yourself. You can look at the prototype library and you can port it. It's not a big deal. Any other question? Yeah. Sorry? Yes, absolutely, yeah. Yes, the screen reader would be able to go through it, yeah. Well, let me show you one more trick, if you don't have another question. What you can do in Rails is the way I organize my behaviors, and if you go to my blog, you'll be able to see the last post I posted about that. But basically what I do is, usually I have standard behaviors for most of my application, and then I have 2 or 3 actions where I have this very complicated JavaScript stuff that's going on with, I can show you an example of something I do with LowPro. I need to log in. Okay, I'm not gonna show you. I'm too lazy. I need to go through the login and stuff. But basically, when you have a very complicated action, you probably don't want to put all these behaviors inside your application.js. You probably don't want to have that on all the pages. So what I do is I use a yield in the header of the HTML, and let me actually just show you this code here. So a lot of people don't know about that, and I learned about that recently. That's really nice. Basically, that's what I do here. Let me zoom in. So what I do is here you go. So in my header, I use yield JavaScript, or yield whatever you want. I just use JavaScript because it's easier for me to remember. And inside the page, inside the view of the action I want to use, if I want to load something else, on top of the page, I just use content for JavaScript, and then I put the specific JavaScript I want to load. So in this case, I'm loading the JavaScript that is used, all the behaviors only used for the photos controller and the show action. So by using this way, you can keep your behavior separate, and you don't have this huge JavaScript file that you have to load all the time. And you only have these tiny files that you use only on specific action. And I realized that it helped me a lot because I would only work on these files, like once in a while, and I don't touch them, but I might work a lot on the main JavaScript file, and I don't mess things up, and it's very clean. So that's the trick I learned, and that can be cool. If you have an application with a lot of JavaScript, a lot of specific behaviors for specific actions, what I recommend is to divide, like in this example. So you create a folder inside the JavaScript folder for the controller name, and then you put all the action in it with one file per action. Yes? Yeah, Patrick has a JavaScript plugin that will do that automatically. So what's the link, Patrick, so everybody can see it? Okay. Oh, somewhere here. What else? Like that? Nope. Yes. Yay! It's on the right. Good. Awesome. Is this one? So now I can be even lazier than before. I don't even need to do all the stuff I was doing. That's awesome. Well, I just learned something. Oh, perfect. Or maybe I should have checked on new stuff before. Any questions for Patrick or myself? Well, that's it then.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.